Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and if I've learned anything in my life as a YouTuber, it's that the people cry out for tier lists. Let's go. Animals and whether I would be friends with them. Uh, okay, so really the people cry out for monsters. Monsters in Warcry specifically. And I get it. There's a lot of really exciting stuff going on in the new edition of Warcry with monsters. Being able to put them in your matched playlists, being able to put them in narrative lists with a lot less trouble. So let's talk about how they work in the game, and then we'll get to the tier list. I promise you. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about some general notes about monsters and what makes them interesting in the game. The first being the activation trade-off. So normal fighters, you activate twice. That is one activation is two actions. You do them all at once, essentially, one and then the other. And then if you have abilities that give you a bonus one, you do that then as well. Obviously, you have the wait action where you can essentially sacrifice an action to wait now, use an ability but not activate, and then activate later non-sequentially, essentially. So you kind of get almost like 1.5 activations if you're waiting instead of two at once. Monsters, however, do it a little differently. They do 3 non-sequential activations. So they do their thing, your opponent gets to go, then they do their thing, the opponent gets to go, then they do their thing. This really changes the dynamic. They can't just do a burst of power all at once, but from an attrition standpoint, they do have one more activation than other fighters, and you do tend to notice that by the end of the round, that that these monsters are just still smacking around, still just a huge factor all the way into, like, from the beginning of the round to the end of the round. The monster is constantly a factor in the gameplay. So it's a really interesting give and take. I think monsters are pointed as if 3 non-sequential activations is less powerful than 2 activations, but in gameplay, I have generally found it to be a little bit more powerful. Another thing to think about with monsters is they have big old bases, and I will be talking about that a lot in the tier list. Those bases do not work on every Warcry board. It makes the flying monsters a completely different game than the ones that don't fly. Some of the monsters have things that will boost their movement. They are generally pretty quick in general, so that can kind of help with those big bases, but that is the one big drawback of monsters, is these huge bases can be kind of difficult to maneuver around on some Warcry boards. Next thing, and this is really the other really powerful thing about monsters. Dragon Maul is just the best ability in the game. It's the best triple in the game. You pick a visible enemy fighter within 6 inches of this monster, remove that fighter from the battlefield, set them up within 1 inch of the monster, then roll a number of dice equal to the value of this ability. For each 4+, allocate 3 damage points to that fighter. So you're putting them anywhere within 1 inch of your monster base from 6 inches away. That is a massive teleport, especially because a lot of these monsters have like 4-inch wide bases, right? So you can get them away from objectives. You can get them away from whoever they, like if it's a treasure mission, monsters can't carry treasure. That's a drawback of theirs. That should help you, especially in treasure missions, if you don't have a monster compete. But they're still useful in those missions, because if someone's hunting down your treasure carrier, you just put them wherever they were trying to get to the carrier. You just take them and you throw them across the board, essentially. Because 11-inch forced teleport is absurd in this game. That's so far, especially for most fighters, right? Any fighter that doesn't have flying is going to take forever to get around, and then they're not just going to be able to go straight to where they were going, because they have to get around the monster. The fact that it also does damage, right? If let's say you have a triple fours, right? You're teleporting them 11 inches away from where they want to be, and then you're doing around 6 points of damage to them on average. Sometimes it'll spike and be a ton. Sometimes it won't be a ton, and you'll still have been happy because you got that crazy teleport. I've also seen people drag their opposing fighter sort of into the rest of their own warband, right? So you Your monster is kind of hanging out with some of your friends. You drag your opponent's most important fighter, stick them where they're with the monster, but also with your friends. So now they can't even disengage away from the monster because you've teleported them into combat with other fighters, and so they can't do a disengage action and be away more than 1 inch away from anything. All this stuff is just incredibly devastating. I do think Dragon Maul is the most powerful ability in the game. And the thing that kind of is interesting on the other side of that, they give you a ton of monster hunting abilities, but on the really good monsters, those abilities tend not to be that impactful, especially the double that gives them -1 move. You're almost always better off trying to just use one of your normal doubles to do more damage to them to bracket them down, because it's just so important to bracket monsters down. That is another thing about monsters. As they take damage, they do decrease in effectiveness. Generally, once you've done about 30 damage to them, most of the monsters in the game will start being a lot less scary. So that is one pretty nice thing that you get when you're fighting against monsters. And I will be doing a follow-up video to this tier list about, dealing with monsters and how to play against monsters. And that'll be a big theme of that video. The other thing about monsters, when you deploy them, they are their own deployment group. So let's say you have your shield, your hammer, and your dagger, and you decide your monster is going to be in your hammer. No other fighters will be in that hammer. Your entire rest of your warband will be in the dagger and shield. That can be pretty exploitable. The current deployment rules in Warcry are actually kind of difficult to game the system the way you could in 1.0. There were a ton of ways to game the system. It's a lot harder now, and monsters are one of the few ways to do it. Finally, so all of this stuff adds up to the fact that even the pretty medium monsters are highly competitive as long as they're usable on the table that you're playing on. Just keep this in mind as I go through the tier list. Even C tier monsters, putting one in your list is oftentimes going to make your list substantially more powerful. Just a quick break here for if you're interested in these kind of topics and you want to hear more about monsters. I did a Tabletop and Beyond podcast just last week. It aired, I think, just a couple days ago, about Horns of Hashut, which is one of the new warbands from the Rotten Ruin set, and monsters. We got into all sorts of stuff, including some of the new news about kind of skinks coming into Warcry. That new box set is going to be pretty exciting, and I can't wait to do kind of a preview episode about that once we see more details. Also, if you want to support the channel and you like these kinds of videos, please consider joining the Patreon. I just really lean on that group for kind of deciding what direction to take the channel, what kinds of new videos to try out and to put out here. So yeah, give it some thought if you like what you're seeing. So now, the first monster I'm going to talk about is the Gargants. They're pretty solid. So one of the things I like about the Gargants is they have a 90 by 52 millimeter base. I am going to talk about the base for every monster. I promise I'm not trying to be repetitive on purpose. It's just that this is a very important thing for each monster, is how maneuverable they are on the board. And the 90 by 52 is pretty manageable. You can rotate them, to squeeze through choke points, which I think is important. There's a lot of fighters in the game on 50 millimeter bases, and those are occasionally annoying, especially if you're playing on Red Harvest, like the lava board. It can be really brutal on the 50 millimeter base models, but pretty much any non-Red Harvest board, 52 millimeters is usually pretty doable, and so these Gargants are actually pretty maneuverable. Drunken Stagger, they also have this, for a double, they have a pretty weird movement buff. It will almost always give them some plus movement. Sometimes it'll be around +4, sometimes it'll only be like +1 or 2, but combined with this smaller base and this movement ability, this really helps mitigate, the classic monster drawbacks that you'll see in some of these other ones that I talk about. So then once you get there, we look at their damage. And one of the things that I really like about the output coming out of Gargants, they're very scary, especially for 315 points. Other fighters around that amount of points tend not to do quite as much damage as they do. And even when they've taken 10 damage, they still only drop down a little bit on that first bracket. really, yeah, you can really take 20 damage before you start really feeling it, and it's not until they've done 30 to you that the Gargant starts being really bad. So that can give you just a lot more staying power than you might otherwise get, especially right at the beginning. So, 13.33, it's not completely board dominant, but it is very scary. So, for example, the Ale Guzzler competes with Tyrants, have very similar damage output, 42 wounds instead of 55 or 45, the same amount of points. The difference really being when you're building your lists and choosing between a Ogre Maw Tribes Tyrant and an Ale Guzzler Gargant is whether you sort of value the ability to have Dragon Maw available to you and the dynamic of the 3 activations versus the Tyrant just not bracketing down. And having that shooting attack, which is not very good and you probably shouldn't ever use. But the Tyrant does have a shooting attack. So as far as list building goes, I think that the Ale Guzzler Gargant is really interesting. I think it's probably better than a Tyrant, but it's really close. It's really just about how much are you getting out of Dragon Maul? How sad are you going to be if you get bracketed down quickly? But this is a really solid one. As far as monsters go, we'll see some better ones. I'm going to put them in B tier, but this is a really happy B tier. Like I said before, everything in C and above is competitively viable. Gargants are really good. Strongly consider them in your lists. People who have been watching the channel know that a Gloomspite Gits list with an Ogre Maw Tribes Tyrant placed first in a tournament in Norway a while ago, right? Tyrants, I consider them really powerful. A lot of folks consider them powerful. A Tyrant would, often win against an Ale Guzzler Gargant because of the bracketing thing, but it would really depend on how the board is playing out, and it's all about just the extra utility that you're getting from Dragon Maul. So, yeah, Gargants are good. Consider them for your lists. By the way, there's 2 here. I know I have the Ale Guzzler on the stats here, but the Chaos one is exactly the same. Actually, I have it a little bit higher in B tier because it's not specifically competing with the Tyrant. There's nothing quite like a Tyrant in Chaos, but also Chaos just has more options for support than an Ale Guzzler gets as far as in Destruction. So it's minute details there. But Chaos Gargant's also very good. If you're a Chaos player, you can play a Gargant just like you can if you're in Destruction. So the next Destruction ones are the Creepy Cave Beasts. And it couldn't be more different with these two. The Arachnarok has 160 millimeter pie plate base, and it doesn't fly. So the problem here is... and especially the movement is not enough to, like, the base is so wide that the movement is only actually comes out to a couple inches in terms of the back of your base being in front of where the front of your base is. So you just can't put it anywhere on the board. I just don't think that you can play them. They also have the same offensive output as an Ale Guzzler Gargant in the same Grand Alliance for 45 more points. So not only are you paying more points for a less usable model. Anyway, so we don't need to talk about the spiders anymore. Dankhold Troggos. Pretty good. I like them. They have a little bit lower damage than the average monster. DPA 4 equals 10. Now, Destruction has better ways to fix this than most Grand Alliances do, right? Because you have the Brugit that any warband can bring in. But the thing that I actually like about Dankhold Troggos is that they're cheap. 280 points is by far the cheapest monster. 45 wounds for 280 points is a lot of wounds. 3 activations, that's a lot of stuff you can do for 280 points at this output level. Less than a lot of leaders. And the cool thing is it's by far the most exploitable deployment situation. 280 points is a lot less than 333, which would be a third of your warband, right? So you can have a Dankhold Troggoth in one deployment group, and that, it's going to hold its own. It's got really big damage output. I mean, 10 is a lot less than other monsters, but as far as regular fighters go, that's very respectable. It's got a ton of wounds to chew through, so your opponents are going to have a really tough time killing it. Plus those 3 activations, when I'm finding when playing with monsters that when your opponent has to come to you and you're not wasting activations to get to them, the 3 attacks on monster level damage over the course of a round can be somewhat overwhelming. And so it just, again, gives you a piece in a deployment group that it's just not going to fall without really making your opponent know about it, which is so helpful in a lot of missions like Reaper, etc. And the amazing thing here is it lets you put a lot more stuff into your other 2 deployment groups than you might be able to. So that makes the Dankhold Troggoth a great utility piece. And then finally, it's got a 60 millimeter base. That's barely more than most of the big fighters in Warcry. I think there might be a few non-monster fighters actually that are on a 60 millimeter base. I know some of the kind of big cavalry leaders, their base is actually longer than 60 millimeters, even if it's not as wide. So all that just to say that the Dankhold is basically just you can move it like a regular fighter on 95% of boards, and that just ends up making it really valuable because it's this move 5, 2-inch range. I mean, those are all just very reasonable stats to have on a 280 point melee fighter, right? Except this is a monster, and so you've got Dragon Maul and you've got 3 activations. That's amazing. The only reason this isn't like an S tier fighter in general is there's a lot of really good monsters. All right, so we've passed destruction, so now let's get on to order. And order gets a pair of sea monsters, which I think look pretty cool. So first, the War Hydra, same stats as a Gargant, but on a much bigger base. The base is 120 millimeters by 92 millimeters. It doesn't fly. It's just kind of a raw deal there. It also really suffers from the Charybdis existing because the Charybdis is just a better fighter. Full stop. So let's talk about the Charybdis instead. The Charybdis is a clone of a War Hydra, but costs 5 more points, and you get Abyssal Howl. Abyssal Howl applies a 3-up net to every model within range, which is sort of dictated by your dice. That, I think, is just a really special ability. You can go up to something or to like a group of somethings and just net everyone around. You have the 2-inch range, right? So anyone who's not right away able to fight you, you're probably going to find someone who you can fight and they can't fight back. And being able to net sort of half of someone's warband, right? I mean, you're going to be hitting 66% of the time with this net ability. The base is pretty big. This is one of the very few times when the base can actually be an advantage for you, is just you're going to have more models within range. If you're netting the whole board, that can completely ruin your opponent's plans. For any of those missions where the place you want to be changes over time, whether it's the ones where people are burning objectives, or whether it's ones like Reaper where it's like hunting things down. Well, you can't do any hunting when you can't move, right? So then you get to completely own the terms of engagement all across the board. And again, this is one of the cheaper monsters, being costing less than a third of your warband. This is an incredibly impactful ability and definitely competitively viable. Now, it does have the issue of the War Hydra where it's not that fast and it is on a really big base, but as long as you can move it around, that net is going to be extremely impactful. And as far as moving it around goes, this is one of the ones where you have the +3 movement ability. Now the War Hydra has a 2, which is nice, but the Charybdis, being able to you move 6, but then you add 3 to it. So if you are having problems, you can get up to that 9-inch movement, which is going to give you a lot more flexibility as far as where you can go. And then, of course, your opponent gets one chance to move one thing out of the way, and then boom, you hit them with the big net. So a lot to like with the Charybdis. That does kind of pale in comparison, though, to what Death can do with their monsters. Now, the Death monsters are, they're basically, again, twins, just like the Order monsters, but they're much more evenly matched. So the first thing to notice, the 130 millimeter base on the big Death Flyers is kind of rough, but the 12-inch flight, I think, mostly makes up for it. So it's really easy to just kind of pick them up and put them back down somewhere in the board, and you can basically be judicious about wherever is the one place where you can set down that massive base. And then once you do, again, drink if I say Dragon Maul, but as long as you can move around the board, Dragon Maul is really forgiving for these fighters who can go somewhere and then just fudge the numbers on what they're doing by just bringing something over to them to fight them. The ones where you start in your deployment and you might not be able to move around the board because there's no flight, those can be tough because you can get stuck in a corner. But the flyers can't get stuck in the corner. They only have a couple bingo spots where they can go. But that makes it so with Dragon Maul, they actually functionally cover the entire board. So these big death flyers, I think, are just really overwhelming in that way. So then the question becomes, which of them to take. So with the Zombie Dragon, you pay 30 points for a pretty big damage boost. The DPA 4 is 16.67. That's huge. They have a +3 attacks triple if for some reason you don't really have a good reason to use Dragon Maul. So there's just a ton of output on the Zombie Dragon. Now, the one reason to take a Terrorgeist, though, is so it does do a lot less damage. It's DPA 4 is 13 1/3. That's still a lot. And, sometimes the Zombie Dragon, sure, it's doing a ton of damage, but the Terrorgeist would still be achieving the same job on the board, still be killing the same things and the same amount of attacks, right? And so just getting that extra 30 points back can just be really valuable. One thing that monsters kind of need is you want to be supporting them. You don't want to completely lose the activations battle, which can let your opponent kind of dance around the monster sometimes. So the Terrorgeist just lets you include more other things in your warband, which can be very valuable. So I think it's really close which one is the more valuable one to take in your warband. I'm a big believer in just raw damage output in general in Warcry, so I would probably lean towards the Zombie Dragon. But I think the Terrorgeist is completely reasonable as well, and especially if you've got just like a warband that you're really excited about in general, those 30 points, you can get a lot for 30 points sometimes elsewhere in Warcry. So take both of these. They will completely dominate your games. When I saw them in action at the Nova Open, I saw a Terrorgeist in action, and it dominated the board in every round that it played in. So absolutely include these in your warband and don't look back if you're in match play and wanting to play competitively. Know casually that a monster that will go anywhere on the board and completely dominate the board when it gets there might not be fun for everyone to play against, right? I would say any of the A and S tier fighters in this might be good to the point of being unfun, but that's your opponent's problem, or your own friendships and relationships problem. But let's not talk about that. All right, so I'm calling it the Zorn kit. We're on to Chaos now. This is the kit that can either make a Slaughter Brute or a Mutalith Vortex Beast. To start, it's 120 by 92 millimeter base with 8-inch move. So 8 inches of move is, I think, better than the ones that move 6 but can be 9 on a double. But it's close. I'd say these are better and more maneuverable than most of the non-flyers, but this is still a liability because they don't have any movement buff. Neither of these do. So you're just stuck with 8. So there are going to be times when you can't really move them around, where 8 inches is not enough to kind of, basically, if you have to climb a 3-inch piece of terrain and then you only move 5 inches, then maybe it's like you clamber onto the to a piece of terrain and then you fall off and hope that you roll well when you fall, something like that. But it can be a little tough there. So that's kind of the one reason they're not climbing up into B. But other than that, they're really great. So let's start with the Slaughter Brute. The thing that's nice about it, it has Beast Unbound, which is a bonus action And it's the rare triple you might actually use over Dragon Maul because specifically, I think for monster versus monster combat, that's a really nice ability because it lets you go up to a monster and then attack it. Or if the other monster comes at the Slaughter Brute, maybe he comes near the Slaughter Brute, Dragon Mauls it nearby. Maybe you take a little bit of damage, but then you get to attack twice, right? You get to attack, Beast Unbound, attack again. You might be double bracketing that monster before the next time they get to attack you, and then you'll still get 2 more attacks, right? So I think Slaughter Brute is one of the more awkward, one of the more cumbersome monsters to be using again, to try to dominate a board in a regular Warcry game. But it has interesting enough applications in specifically monster versus monster games where I think it's still worth considering. The Mutalith Vortex Beast is sort of Chaos's version of a control monster. They can pull on just a double. Now it's kind of a basic pull ability like Bloodbind out of Khorne, something like that. And they have somewhat low damage for a monster, but it's still reasonable. But the special thing really is the pull in that you can, Dragon Maul for a triple, or you can pull for a double depending on what your dice are. You can even do both, right, on successive activations. So there's just a lot of play to the Mutalith Vortex Beast. And so again, I think that's enough to make up for that 8-inch move. Maybe you won't be able to get everywhere you want to on the board, but you can bring them to you a little bit more easily, or you can at least bring more things to you as opposed to only Dragon Mauling one thing and then maybe you kill it later and then it's like you have this wasted activation. That probably won't be the case with a Mutalith Vortex Beast, right? You'll be able to pull multiple things to you, which will be really valuable. So in general, I think that just having that much play to it, keeps the Vortex Beast from getting down there with the War Hydra, and I still think makes it a very competitively viable monster to be using. However, Chaos has plenty of monsters in general, right? So the next ones are just the huge damage output ones. The first one being the Gorgon. It's second to the Chimera in damage output in the game, but it only costs 330 points, and it keeps most of its damage while it's bracketing. So the fact that it doesn't go down much, doesn't cost that many points, you get so much just pure output in your warband if you do this. I did spell unwieldy wrong there, which is too bad, but just all of that output is, I think, really impressive and a really great reason to play with the Gorgon. Now, it's got, this problem of 120 millimeter base on only move 6. It only costs a double to give it +3 move, but really you're just playing this hoping that you can put it on the board where you need to, and then it'll just do so much damage, just a mind-boggling amount of damage. And especially for the points, at 330 points, it costs way less than the monsters that do similar damage. Yeah, what more can you say? The Gorgon just absolutely batters everything. Now, the Hell Pit Abomination also does an above average amount of damage. The lower strength, though, means that, it's still got the 4 and 10 for the amount of damage it does. Still the same amount of attacks as the Gorgon. It's just the lower strength means that it's more suited to just mowing down chaff, whereas the Gorgon can really put that damage on anything it wants to, which just makes it absurd. Like, it's incredibly good at just hunting down opposing leaders and just annihilating them off the board, whereas the Hell Pit Abomination's not going to be as good at that. The one thing, though, about it, I think they really went towards making like a defensive juggernaut with the Hell Pit Abomination. I don't know if they fully succeeded, but you can do some fun things like the heal ability. Normally it's kind of bad, but here it's kind of useful when you're on the border of a bracket. You can heal yourself up into the better bracket and then do a lot more output than you would otherwise be able to. The ability suite is very flavorful as far as being kind of this terrifying, unkillable monster. Personally, I would not use it over a Gorgon because it's just harder to put where you want it to be, and it doesn't do as much damage, and it costs 20 more points. All right, so we're getting into the best monsters in the game here, and the Cygor, it needed some love. It really needed love, because the problem with the Cygor is it's just been so celebrated for how bad it is in AOS for so long. Now, I don't know in the meta. I know that Beasts of Chaos have gotten a little bit better recently. I don't know if the Cygor was a beneficiary there. I'd be curious. Let me know in the comments if Cygors are viable in AOS now. But what I can tell you is they're incredible in Warcry. Absolutely busted. First things first, actually, they have the thing that you would hate, right? So 120 millimeter by 92 millimeter base, huge base, move 6. So lots of situations where they can get stuck and can't move around the board. Now, the funny thing is, though, they completely overcome this by having a ridiculous ranged attack. One, they're taller than everybody, so they can see over all the terrain. So not being able to move past certain bits of terrain sometimes isn't going to hurt you with the Cygor, and you'll still be able to affect the battlefield wherever you want to because of, it's so tall, it can see everything, and then you've got this ridiculous artillery ability. So let's talk about it. It's kind of a fun mechanic. So you start off, the Cygor is holding a boulder. The boulder is usually going to do around 10 or 15 damage at 15 inches of range. Now, that is an absurd amount of damage. Now, it is a triple, so you are spending a triple to do it, but that is still absurd output at range. Then, once it's thrown the boulder, it is now empty-handed. So then you pay a double to reload, and then, you can just do a triple next round. You're not going to have 2 triples in a round, but it's not that unusual to be able to manage a full house using your wild dice. And so being able to just constantly refill and constantly throw this 10 to 15 damage at range every round, and 15 inches is a lot. It's really hard to get out of the way there. And again, this is an ability, so people don't get to take cover easily. The Cygor is ridiculously tall, so it's almost impossible to hide from it. All of that is really special, and that's assuming that you can't move around the board effectively. If you do get to deploy somewhere where you can get around the board, which is going to be most games, right? The sort of horror scenario for you of you get stuck in a corner because you can't move anywhere, and deployment was unkind to you. On most Warcry boards, that's going to happen less than half of the time, right? More than half of the time, especially kind of speaking with other people who have played monsters, more than half of the time you can at least move it to most of the board. There's often going to be places where your opponent can hide from melee damage, but you're still going to be able to get anywhere where that 15-inch range can affect pretty much the entire board. However, it also has really impressive melee damage. It's below average for monsters, right? DPA 4 of 10 and 2/3 is definitely less than what most of the monsters on this list have, but it's still incredibly scary, by any other metric, and it's above rate for 310 points. Most 310 point fighters are actually hovering in that 9.5, 10 range for how much damage they do in one activation. So your opponent doesn't want to go mess with this Cygor, right? It's going to put a ton of damage onto them. But if they don't do something about it, if they don't take it down, it's going to keep throwing 10 to 15 damage around, and that artillery ability doesn't go down. The other thing you get to do is you get to walk forward with it. You do get to initiate combat and attack people and also be hurling boulders at other things. And these boulders don't suffer from the current Warcry rule against shooting where you can't shoot into combat. The Cygor has no issues with smushing boulders into combat. It's so accurate. It always hits its target with its boulder. Doesn't always do the same amount of damage it wants to, but it always smacks its target. So it's just absurd. And when you have it in melee and throwing its boulder around, the amount of damage output that you're doing is incredible, and the way that you're putting it anywhere you want to is just overwhelming for your opponent. So the Cygor is really, truly a board-dominating piece of beef. I don't know what else to say about it. Whether you want to call it, the cannon cow, the cow boucher, the bovine ballista, whatever you want to call it, it is an incredible terrifying monster for Warcry, and I wish I had one. Speaking of things I wish I had, and I do have one that is unpainted and is on my hobby table at the moment, is I think the best unit in all of Warcry at the moment, which is the Chimera. And by the way, monsters are so amazing that I do think that the Cygor is the second best unit in the game. But the Chimera. So first of all, 120 by 90 millimeter base, very standard for monsters. However, this one has 12 inches of move and flying. So that's a lot easier to place than the 130 millimeter bases of the big death monsters, right? Basically, you get to pick up this thing and put it down wherever you want. You know, the 12-inch move and flying, and the shape of that base, it's very, very extremely rare that you won't find a place on the board where you can put that. So, yeah, just think of mobility with the Chimera as just a non-issue. The damage on this thing is absurd. 6 attacks, 5 and 10s, strength 6 is just so weirdly far ahead of every other anything in the game. I don't understand it. The DPA 5 is 25, right? Not DPA 4 against toughness 4. Against toughness 5, it's doing 25 points of damage on average. This is double the total of some of these other monsters, right? And there's a real one-shot watch, right? As far as like fly into position, Dragon Maul, then attack later, right? If anything on the board that has activated, your opponent or your Chimera can basically just kill it with no reprisal, right? Because you just fly over, Dragon Maul it, it's already activated, and now on your next attack you just kill it. The damage goes down a little bit when you take a bracket, but not by that much, right? The DPA 5 after you've taken one bracket is still 20. 20 is ridiculous. After you've taken another bracket, it's still really respectable. So the Chimera just continues to completely dominate the board, and it's also, for some reason, got a good ability. Leon and Roar. You're still going to use Dragon Maul 90% of the time, right? Dragon Maul is the best ability in the game. Every monster is going to use it. However, Leon and Roar is still really solid. Going -1 attack to people with, you know, in your aura buff is really good, especially on monsters that have such a big base. That's such a wide area of aura to pick up. So it all goes to just Chimeras being completely absurd. I've played with one in my game. It was a Bloodthirster that is on the same base as Chimeras, but it's what convinced me to go out and get one. And it just easily tabled. I was playing just like a basic Khorne Bloodbound Warband. It was some Blood Reavers, some Blood Warriors, and a Chimera against the list that I went 3-1 and almost won Nova with. It tabled the list that I took to Nova. It just like easily won, because anytime you can put the monster somewhere where your opponent has to come to the monster, and then for most of the game the monster is just using its activations to attack stuff, it can be a really good situation. And you know, Blood Reavers were cheap enough that that I wasn't completely losing the activation war. Now, it did teach me a lot about how to fight monsters, and that's when, you know, I would have done it differently. I think if I played my Nova Open Warband against that Chimera list, it wouldn't be quite so lopsided. But it's still just incredibly instructive, because it was a Chimera that wasn't even really being supported by a very good warband. It was just kind of a hodgepodge of things that were in my basement at the time when I was testing. So it's just an absolutely ridiculous piece. I know that some folks on the Dayton Warcry Club have been testing Chimeras, and they find that a well-supported Chimera list just absolutely tables whatever it goes up against. I've been a big supporter of supporting the Chimera with Nurgle Demons. I also think that Spire Tyrants are a really good option, because Spire Tyrants have a really good netter. I also think that the Unmade, the Chaos Slanesh faction that lives in the Death world. All of their fighters have nets. The one reason I like the Unmade is that their leader has 8-inch move. The one weakness of any monster warband is treasure missions. So having an 8-inch move fighter in a treasure mission is really nice to have. And then you just have your Chimera be the real bodyguard by just walking up and killing anything that could kill your Unmade leader, which is admittedly quite fragile. And then, of course, you have all these nets around, right? Because nets are just so good. And again, nets in treasure missions are extremely good. And so that's kind of a combination of support that I think would be really powerful. So somewhere between those three warbands, I think is kind of the ideal place to put your Chimera, either Nurgle, Unmade, or Spire Tyrants. But regardless, a Chimera list that's not in those factions is still going to be the most scary list in any play group that doesn't have another Chimera list. Chimeras are just so completely out of bounds powerful. Now, what you want to do with that information is up to you, right? Is if you're wanting to paint for a tournament that's coming up, absolutely, I would go with a Chimera list. If you are just wanting to have good times with your play group, maybe you guys talk and that way, if one of you does try the Chimera, you know what you're up against and you don't feel bad when you get completely roasted. Think about that a little bit, kind of do with that information what you will, but I would just say Chimeras are completely, utterly absurd. So let's kind of pick this up for one final tier list. And that is, of course, breakfast cereals, right? Or breakfast foods. Now, omelets, completely overpowered. Management is telling me that I have to stick to Warcry. So I changed some things around, right? I kind of made those slides and then was like, well, actually, I'm kind of talking myself into the Slaughter Brute. I then in the course of the video kind of talked myself out of the Slaughter Brute. I kind of go back and forth on whether it belongs in B tier. The same with the Dankhold Troggoth. I kind of talked myself out of it, but then talked myself back into it again. I do think the Dankhold Troggoth is legit because of the kind of deployment shenanigans you can do with it. All of those S, A, and B tier fighters are things that you can 100% go win a tournament with. And I think that's also true of the C tier ones too, although I don't really know how I would do it. Whereas at least with, the B tier ones, you're not doing one of the completely overwhelming A and S tier ones, but like I said, the Slaughter Brute has real applications for monster versus monster fights, even if it's the least good monster against regular warbands. The Charybdis, I have a sense of how that plays out to be really powerful. The Gargants, the same thing. The Gorgon, just all that output for 60 points fewer than the Chimera, right? The theory around using that Gorgon is essentially, I want a Chimera list, but the Chimera is just killing everything so easily that a Gorgon would kill the same things that the Chimera is killing, but I'll get to save 60 points and put that somewhere else. I think that's totally valid. I think the Chimera is much better than the Gorgon, but I can see where you can win a tournament with that Gorgon, right? So all of these are just completely incredible at winning Warcry games. Now, I don't expect that monsters will be completely ridiculous forever. I would expect to either see a change to Dragon Maul or a change to some of the Monster Hunter abilities in probably not this Tome of Champions, but eventually down the road. So just be aware if you're thinking about buying one of these monsters and you're kind of on a budget. I would consider buying one that fits with a faction that you just kind of love and would play even if it wasn't as competitive, because that way at least you'll get a lot more play out of it even once it's not completely out of this world good. But that said, for this current edition of Warcry, and it makes sense, right? We are in Gur. It makes sense for monsters to be really good. I've heard some folks talk about how the shout out to you, it's one of my patrons, and I feel awful that I'm forgetting who it was, but someone mentioned to me that the new Heart of Gur box is a lot more maneuverable for monsters than any of the older terrain was. It's more maneuverable than the original terrain. It's more maneuverable than Red Harvest. I mean, everything is more maneuverable than Red Harvest, right? But of the previous boxes, the only one that's kind of less maneuverable is the Soul Drain forest, or sorry, the one that's easier for monsters is the Soul Drain Forest. Everything else is just much harder on monsters than the Heart of Gur is, and that's probably by design to make kind of help give that kind of flavorful Realm of Beasts feel. And you know, I hope you like monsters because I do think there's going to be interesting stuff interplay with two warbands that both have a monster in the warband. But you know, in general, monsters are just really good. They're not completely unbeatable, right? They do have this weakness in treasure missions. I was fortunate enough to come up against a Terrorgeist in a treasure mission, which is kind of a weakness for them at Nova, and so I was able to win against it. And I was able to actually remove the Terrorgeist from the board, but that was partly because I had built my warband thinking about monsters and having tested against them. So they're not like, it's not like you can't win against a monster, but they do completely dominate, and that is both exciting and terrifying, which is what monsters should be. So I'll be back with a few more kind of follow-up videos in this vein. We have a massive 60-player, already sold-out event at Warhammer World to kind of cover and to talk about, and I will be making a video very soon about what I would play at that tournament. After that, I will be making a video about how to play with and against monsters, right? I've talked about which ones are the best. The next is clearly to talk about kind of how to get the most out of them. So I'm very excited to dive into that. And, you know, until then, may all your rolls be crits.